Our key question is whether the societal transformation to sustainability, to which, at least at the declaratory level, modern societies are firmly committed, might in practice actually be impossible to achieve. And if that is so, why that may be so. Now, we are exploring what kind of transformations are going or might be going on instead, and how they might relate to the socio-ecological transformation which many activists and many scientists say urgently has to happen, but which for some reason simply refuses to materialize. Now, in line with that agenda, I want tonight to do three things. I want to talk about three things. The first one is the change in social value preferences and the shift in political culture that we are witnessing in contemporary consumer societies. The second one is the rise of right-wing populist movements and the rise of right-wing populist parties, such as the ones which are governing this country, and who are conducting, I would say, a head-on attack on eco-democratic values and eco-democratic agendas. And thirdly, I want to talk about Ronald Ingolfur, now I can't see my paper anymore, who is, in a sense, the founding father of the academic study of social values and political culture, and whose well-known theory of the silent revolution tells us that in the wake of modernization, our societies should be becoming ever more environmental and ever more democratic, and who has just published a new book in which he actually reasserts the validity of this theory, and in which he conceptualizes, and that is where the subtitle of my talk comes from, current right-wing populism, as actually many others have done, as a cultural backlash, a great regression, and a silent revolution in reverse. Overall, I want to, in a sense, deliver the counterpart, for those of you who were here last night, to Karin Bäckstrand's talk last night. Karin focused very much, I would say, on the supply side, that is, on what the state can do, and in Sweden does do. I, in contrast, want to place the primary focus on the demand side, i.e. on what citizens want and what citizens are prepared to accept. The argument I want to make is, firstly, that modernization and emancipation induced change in social value preferences in contemporary societies goes a long way in explaining why the sustainability transformation does not happen. That is, in explaining the resilience of unsustainability. Secondly, that the rise of right-wing populism, and I want to call it the populist revolution, is not very well conceptualized as a reversal of or a backlash against the emancipatory agenda and the emancipatory trajectory. Instead, it might actually be a dialectically transformed and politically outsourced continuation of exactly that agenda and trajectory. And thirdly, that the change in political culture that is occurring in the wake of the populist revolution is part of modern consumer society's adaptation to or resilience towards sustained unsustainability. Resilience. This concept that has now popped up a number of times has recently become quite popular, at least in parts of the eco-political literature. It is normally clearly, or it has normally clearly positive connotations, and it is not very commonly used together with the term unsustainability. It describes the ability of a system or the ability of established order to respond to and to adapt to external irritations, to disruptions of its stability, and to restabilize itself following such disruptions and following such challenges to its stability. In a much quoted article of 2007, Donald Nelson and colleagues define resilience as the amount of change a system can undergo and still retain the same function and structure while maintaining options to develop. Now, what I find particularly interesting in this definition is the phrase "still retain the same function and structure." This phrase is interesting because it signals a shift of perspective, in line with the factual reality that modern societies, whatever their rhetoric, are adamantly defending the order of unsustainability. The concept of resilience shifts the emphasis, the focus, from the question how do or how may contemporary consumer societies achieve a structural transformation of the established order of unsustainability to the new question, how does the established but challenged order of unsustainability restabilize itself, or how may it be restabilized? As I indicated before, I believe that a shift in prevalent social value orientations and a major change in the political culture of liberal consumer democracies are centrally important elements of the resilience, perhaps even of the resilience strategy of modern consumer societies. This approach via political values or social values and political culture has, of course, many drawbacks and many limitations. That is without question, but I think it is also incredibly powerful and incredibly important, not least because the prevailing social norms and the social value preferences on the basis of which societal conditions and developments are being perceived as desirable or undesirable, as problematic or unproblematic, and the political culture, that is, the political procedures and the institutions available to process societal change, to pacify social conflicts and to legitimate political decisions, clearly are crucially important for the resilience or the non-resilience of modern societies to environmental change, to climate change, and to the social and political implications all this may have. As I said before, Ronald Inglehart may be regarded as the founding father of the academic study of social value change and political culture. And his hypothesis that in the wake of their ongoing modernization, modern societies are experiencing a shift in value preferences from material values to post-material values, including democratic and environmental values, or, as he later put it, from values of material security to values of cultural identity and self-expression, is well known and much debated. Now, interestingly, in his most recent work, Environmental Values and the concept of post-materialism, which once figured very prominently in his theory of the silent revolution, suddenly do not play a major role anymore. But as regards democratic values and values of self-expression, Inglehart essentially reconfirms his argument that modernization transforms social life and political institutions, bringing rising mass participation in politics and, in the long run, making democratic political institutions ever more likely. 2018. More than ever, he seems convinced that in the long run, the cognitive mobilization and changes in mass values linked to modernization tend to bring democracy. These values linked to modernization are in particular what he calls self-expression values. And he believes self-expression values emerge when a large share of the population grows up taking survival for granted. And since democratic institutions provide greater free choice than authoritarian institutions, people with self-expression values generally want democracy. So he argues socioeconomic development makes people more likely to want democracy, and cognitive mobilization makes them more likely to get democracy because it increases their ability to organize and push it through. And explicitly referring to contemporary concerns about the crisis of democracy, the end of democracy, or the death of democracy, Ingolfur insists that the hypothesis that democracy has reached its high watermark and it is in long-term retreat is mistaken. He reassures us actually there is no need to panic. The dynamics of modernization and democracy are becoming increasingly clear, he says, and it is unlikely that they will fail to function in the long run. So this is Ingolfur's story on democracy. And I think in the light of current debates about post-democracy and the challenge of right-wing populism to liberal democracy, it is a rather curious story that can be questioned or challenged in a number of different ways. My question here is, how does it contribute to the actual topic of my talk, and that is the resilience of unsustainability? As I said before, environmental values, climate change, post-materialism and so on don't actually figure in his model very prominently. And in any case, his theory would suggest that modernization-induced value change and culture change makes the socio-ecological transformation that we are talking about ever more likely. Now, that is increasingly hard to believe. So one might well be tempted to dismiss Ingolfur's argument wholesale and categorize it as a case of academic path dependency. But I think we should be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. After all, the claim that post-materialist value orientations are on the rise, for example in post-growth movements, which we've been talking about on this conference a lot, is still very common in significant parts of the recent literature. And whilst I personally would take issue with that particular point, there are, I think, a number of other respects in which we are well advised to listen to Ingolfur and where Ingolfur is fully right. For example, bearing in mind that much of the current literature puts the primary focus on hierarchical power relations, on uncontrollable logics and dynamics of social systems, on embedded social practices and so on, I think Ingolfur is right in bringing the autonomous subject, the individual, its identity and so on back in, or putting it center stage. Also, I think Ingolfur is right in placing a particular focus on the well-educated progressive middle class, the cultural creatives, who in the literature are quite commonly portrayed and who understand themselves often as pioneers of change. Next, Ingolfur is right in holding on to the theory of modernization-induced culture and value change, and to claim that in the wake of modernization, emancipatory demands for autonomy, for self-determination, for self-expression and so on are being articulated ever more vociferously. Fourth, Ingolfur is right in regarding the ever-increasing demand for choice as a central driver of societal change. And finally, Ingolfur is also right in insisting that the hypothesis of the end of democracy is mistaken. For what we are witnessing is not the end, but the radical transformation of democracy. So these are a number of respects, I think, in which Ingolfur is absolutely right, and where Ingolfur can give us quite good guidance in trying to explain the resilience of unsustainability. Having said that, though, Ingolfur also has a number of fundamental weaknesses. For example, he does not explore in any detail what kind of self, what kind of subjectivity or identity his values of self-expression, self-determination and self-realization are aiming for, are supposed to be geared towards, and whether and how prevalent understandings of this self may actually be changing or have changed. Secondly, he does not undertake any attempt to spell out what the notions of freedom and autonomy may imply other than free choice. Nor does he explore whether and how prevalent notions of freedom and autonomy may change or may have changed. And third, he does not differentiate between different forms of democracy, but he makes very simplistic and generalizing claims about the relationship between modernization and democracy. Now, these are quite fundamental deficits, but I think if we further pursue those elements in Engelhart's theory which are arguably entirely right, and at the same time try to iron out the fundamental weaknesses of his model, we will get quite a bit further in terms of explaining the resilience of unsustainability, that is the obstacles to a socio-ecological transformation, and in explaining modern society's resilience to sustained unsustainability. Now, as regards the understanding of the self, which ever more prevalent values of self-determination, self-expression, and self-experience, self-realization are aiming to constitute, to articulate, to present, and so on, there is, and we've talked about that on this conference a lot, a rich body of literature suggesting that in the well-educated middle classes in particular, that is exactly in those parts of society where Engelhart locates the silent revolution, the self and self-identity are ever less socially determined, predetermined, and ever more a project which the individual pursues, can pursue, is forced to pursue, themselves relying on the resources which they themselves can mobilize for this purpose. Furthermore, this literature suggests that this self, this identity, are ever less unitary, homogeneous, and stable, and are becoming ever more complex, multiple, fractional, and dynamic. And thirdly, this self and identity are constructed, articulated, displayed, and experienced ever more through choices offered in the consumer market. If, and to the extent that all this is the case, the modernization-induced rise of self-expression and identity values, which Engelhart quite correctly highlights, may more specifically be conceptualized as the rise of the unsustainable self. For with individualization, with pluralization and flexibilization of prevailing notions of subjectivity and identity, with ever increasing pressure on the individual to mobilize all available resources, to take full responsibility for the success or failure of their project of self-realization, with choices in the consumer market having become the primary mode of self-expression and self-construction and self-experience, with the massive geographical expansion of individual life worlds, lifestyles, and arenas of self-experience, one might say, and with flexibility, innovation, and acceleration, that is, with planned obsolescence, having become a core principle not only of the consumer market, but also of self-construction and self-experience, unsustainability is no longer an unintended, undesirable, and potentially amendable side effect, but it is a constitutive core principle of modern identity, modern lifestyles, and modern society. Put differently, the subjectivities and the patterns of self-realization of the most innovative and the most progressive parts of society in particular are, whatever the contestations to the contrary, unsustainable by intention and by design. The analysis of this value and culture shift, that is the analysis of the rise of the unsustainable self, whilst not providing an exclusive explanation, or exhaustive explanation of course, can therefore take us a long way in explaining the resilience of unsustainability, and it raises fundamental questions about the sociologically rather questionable narratives which are on offer in large parts of the transformation literature. This analysis may be further developed by addressing the second major deficit of Ingolfur's story, namely his failure to spell out what exactly the ideals of freedom and autonomy, which his increasingly emancipated and self-expressive individuals are pursuing, what they are supposed to imply. Now, Ingolfur is undoubtedly right in saying that in the era of neoliberalism, of hegemonic neoliberalism, freedom and autonomy are ever more exclusively understood as free choice. But he's fundamentally wrong when implying that this particular understanding of freedom and autonomy has always been prevalent, or that this particular understanding is conducive to eco-democratic agendas as those he was dealing with at the time of the silent revolution. Indeed, for the emancipatory new social movements of the 1970s and for their projects of new politics, as it was called at the time, an entirely different understanding of authentic freedom and autonomy was constitutive. Rather than free choice, it emphasized the categorical validity of a whole range of limitations, of restrictions, of boundaries which had to be kept. In line with the Kantian Protestant tradition, as well as the tradition of post-Marxist critical theory, these emancipatory movements firstly understood authentic freedom and autonomy of the human subject primarily, not exclusively, but primarily as inner, as moral, as intellectual freedom, as dignity and integrity of the human being, rather than as material fulfillment in the empirical world through free choice in the consumer market. Secondly, freedom and autonomy implied the ability, indeed the duty, to recognize, to follow, to appreciate the guidance of imperatives of reason as opposed to superstition, to ideology, to animalistic instincts and any other causes, as Kant would have said, of self-incurred immaturity. Third, freedom and autonomy were understood in a collective rather than in an individualistic sense. That is, they were limited by the principles of inclusion, equality, and reciprocity. And fourth, freedom and autonomy were conceptualized as ecologically inclusive. That is, and he was talking about this this morning, as limited by the imperative to grant nature and every part of it the same liberty, dignity, and integrity that modern societies grant, de jure at least, all human subjects. Now, precisely within these boundaries, precisely defined in exactly this way, freedom and self-determination were the normative foundation, the political objective of emancipatory and eco-democratic project. And only if defined in this way and within these boundaries are the emancipatory agenda and the rise of self-expression values conducive to socio-ecological transformations in modern society. Yet, the logic of emancipation and the dynamics of emancipatory movements is not known for respecting boundaries. Quite the contrary, the transgression of boundaries, the removal of boundaries, of all restrictions, are their core business, one might say. And thus, this logic and this dynamics hollowed out the very foundations, the fundamental norms on which the eco-democratic project and Ingolfur's model of the silent revolution are based. Incrementally, they depleted the normative resources of this eco-democratic project and of Engelhart's model, and in a dialectical turn, emancipatory movements metamorphosed from the proponents and agents of this project into its gravedigger. This is the dialectics of emancipation. And this dialectics explains how and why the most emancipated and the most progressive parts of contemporary consumer societies, which Engelhart conceptualized as the drivers of the silent revolution, are in fact a key parameter when it comes to explaining the resilience of unsustainability. For these most emancipated and most progressive parts of society have embraced, and they are adamantly defending, notions of freedom and autonomy and patterns of self-realization, self-expression and self-experience, which have moved beyond those Kantian boundaries and emancipated themselves from those restrictions which are just outlined and which underpinned Engelhart's assumption that the modernization-induced rise of self-expression values would be favorable to both ecological and democratic agendas. I suppose the majority of us here in the room belongs to this well-educated and emancipated and progressive part of society whose uncompromising defense of their freedom, of their values and of their lifestyles secures and stabilizes the order of unsustainability. Now, the tacit recognition that this shift in prevalent notions of freedom, of identity, of self-determination, and so on, may well be the reason, I think, why in Engelhart's new work, post-materialism and environmentalism are suddenly not any longer very prominent. In any case, I think it is now evident why it is mistaken to describe contemporary politics and the ongoing change in political culture as a silent revolution in reverse, as a cultural backlash, as a great regression. Such conceptualizations imply that the norms which once underpinned the silent revolution, the emancipatory agenda and progressive politics, remain fully valid and in place, and that what we are currently experiencing is just a temporary deviation from a normal course of modernization to which we can and to which in due course we will, there's no reason to panic, return, and then in the long run, as Engelhart always puts it, achieve their full implementation. Put differently, such conceptualizations are the explicit reassurance that there is no need to panic are essentially the socially and politically sedative performance, the simulative maintenance of norms and values which have factually long been abundant because they are incompatible with contemporary understandings of freedom, of self-determination, and a good life. Such conceptualizations either fail to recognize or they deny that current developments are not a deviation from the trajectory of modernization and emancipation, but they are its continuation. That any return to a supposedly normal course or a status quo ante is not to be expected, and that the still widespread attempt to portray and the projected socio-ecological transformation in terms of an emancipatory promise and an emancipatory gain is fundamentally unsupportable, let's put it that way, from a social theoretical perspective. Thus, rather than being a silent revolution in reverse, a cultural backlash or a great regression, recent political developments and the ongoing shift in political culture are consistent with the rise of self-expression values that Ingolfur already diagnosed in the 1970s, but that in the wake of further modernization and what I described as the dialectic of emancipation has radically exchanged its normative core. That's important, of course. This modernization-induced exchange in its normative core does not render the emancipatory project and the progressive middle class anti-environmental or anti-democratic, but the dialectic of emancipation fundamentally reconfigures what both environmentalism and the democratic agenda mean. Now, this takes me to the third major deficit of Ingolfur's analysis, and that is his failure to distinguish between different forms of democracy and to explore the evident modernization-induced and, I would say, emancipation-induced transformation of democracy that we're experiencing right now. And it takes me to the populist revolution. For this is exactly, I would argue, where this transformation of democracy is taking place, where it is being organized. Let me take a brief look at what Ingolfur has to say about right-wing populism. Ingolfur suggests that the current tide of right-wing populism has been triggered by the experience of declining economic security. That is in line with his hierarchy of needs. Decades of declining real income and rising inequality, together with unprecedented massive immigration, have produced a long-term period effect supporting the populist vote. But although he believes that the high present level of support for populist movements and parties largely reflects the declining economic security, rising economic inequality and massive immigration, he insists that underneath this period effect, cultural difference continue to be the strongest predictors of votes for populist parties. Age-linked cultural differences continue to be the strongest predictors of who votes for populist parties. Support for xenophobic, populist authoritarianism or authoritarian movements is motivated by backlash against cultural change. Ultimately, Ingolfur says economic factors such as income and unemployment rates are surprisingly weak predictors of the populist authoritarian vote, but more than economic factors, he argues, support for these parties is motivated by a backlash against the cultural changes linked with the rise of post-materialist values and self-expression values. Now, in contrast to economic factors, which he describes as period factors, this cultural backlash, he argues, is a cohort effect. And rapid cultural change, coupled with large-scale immigration, tends to make older people feel that they live in a country or an environment which is very different from the one in which they grew up. But the good news is, period effects, that is economic insecurity, are only temporary. And the cohort effect is also only temporary, because with generational exchange, the authoritarian reflex will actually disappear, and right-wing populism is only a passing tide, not, as I put it, a populist revolution. He does acknowledge that democracy is currently in retreat, but he is confident that with subsequent economic recovery, post-materialist and democratic self-expression values will recover. And with intergenerational replacement, the emergence of younger cohorts will make sure that modern societies once again become less authoritarian and more democratic. So this is why Ingolfur comes to the conclusion there is no reason to panic. There is, I think, a whole range of respects in which we would want to, at least I, would want to take issue with this analysis. In fact, I think this story is academically as well as politically hugely irresponsible. But that is not our topic here. I cannot go into much detail. With what I again want to focus on is how does this contribute to explaining the resilience of unsustainability. And coming back to my argument that the currently ongoing change in political culture ought to be seen as a continuation rather than a reversal of the progressive middle class's emancipatory project, I want to focus on just one single point. With a simplistic notion of modernization, and with this equally simplistic dualism of democracy on the one side and authoritarianism on the other, Ingolfur completely fails to recognize, or he denies, that how and why the populist revolution currently reconfigures democracy. He only knows the other side of democracy, authoritarianism. He doesn't look even at the possibility that what we're experiencing might be a reconfiguration of democracy, which, as he quite rightly points out, has by no means reached its end. So he does say that, but he does not take into account the possibility of transformation. He fails to recognize that the ongoing process of modernization and the dialectic of emancipation have in fact given rise to a multiple dysfunctionality of democracy, indeed what I would call a legitimation crisis of democracy. For in the context where, contrary to Ingolfur's assumptions, economic growth is unlikely to recover in any significant and lasting manner anyway, and where the most progressive parts, the most privileged and emancipated social groups in particular, are regarding their delimited notions of freedom and self-realization as absolutely non-negotiable, socially egalitarian and even redistributive forms of democracy are becoming massively counterproductive. So the emancipatory agenda pushes the necessity to reframe, reconfigure democracy in such a way that it accommodates contemporary understandings of self-realization and self-expression. Put differently, although Ingolfur rightly highlights that the significance of the underlying cultural demand and the necessity to analyze the dynamics and the relationship between cultural values and democratic institutions, he fails to deliver exactly that. He fails to recognize that rather than being a short-term anti-democratic tide, the authoritarian reflex, the populist revolution lastingly reconfigures democracy so as to enable it to manage ever higher levels of social inequality, indeed to politically organize and legitimate politics of ever higher levels of exclusion. Because exactly that is what updated values of self-realization, what updated values of self-expression, of the most progressive and emancipated part of society in particular, indispensably and urgently need. And delivering just that, that is by remolding democracy into a tool for the majoritarian politics of exclusion, the populist revolution substantially increases modern society's resilience to social and ecological unsustainability. So, I'm not just suggesting that the self-expression values of the emancipated and progressive middle class, rather than facilitating a socio-ecological transformation, are a major cause of the resilience of unsustainability, but I'm also making a direct connection between this progressive and emancipatory middle class and the rise of what is called the regressive and authoritarian right-wing populism. I'm not doing so, and this is important to stress, with any kind of moralizing intentions. But I'm doing this as part or from the perspective of a reflexive critical sociology. And I'm fully aware, of course, of the manifold problems that this entails. One methodological problem of making such a direct connection between the progressive and emancipatory agenda and right-wing populist movements and parties on the other side is that both sides are at pains to emphasize their mutual difference, opposition, and incompatibility. Whilst populist movements untiringly rally against the socio-political establishment and their institutions, vociferously insisting that they are the people and demanding to drain the swamp, the educated middle classes and civilized civil society too make every effort to draw a clear line between themselves and the irrational, immoral, and uncivilized mob. They too are firmly committed to draining the swamp. From a sociological perspective, however, and looking beyond the self-descriptions of the respective actors, I think it is thoroughly possible and in fact very constructive to try to bridge this abyss with the actors from both sides are discursively constructing and trying to maintain. From a sociological perspective, it is possible, I think, and instructive to think a kind of symbiosis or synergy, not conscious, not strategic, of course, between, on the one hand, those whose non-negotiable, delimited notions of freedom and self-realization render a radical politics of exclusion indispensable, but whose self-perception and self-descriptions do not allow them to self-organize this politics of exclusion, and on the other hand, those to whom they outsource this task, who institutionalize and extend the logic of social exclusion, and whom they criticize for their immoral, irrational, and uncivilized behavior. Neither of these actors could or ever would concede anything like such a symbiosis. Evident, no need to discuss. Yet this kind of outsourcing has always been a standard practice in liberal capitalist consumer societies. It is, I would argue, thoroughly comparable, for example, to the outsourcing of the socially and ecologically destructive sourcing of raw materials, the production of cheap consumer goods, or the disposal of problematic wastes to countries of the global south. So this is a kind of inner societal outsourcing to a particular political group. This kind of outsourcing has always helped to secure the resilience of unsustainability, and it is, I'm arguing, a core element of modern society's resilience strategy to sustained unsustainability. Thanks.